Throughout this video, I'll be sharing 6 of the most clever hinged hoop house designs, with some tips and tricks along the way to make your hoop house build easy, durable, and cost effective. Building a hoop house can give you the flexibility to protect your plants from cold, heat, and pests by switching out plastic, shade cloth, or insect netting as needed. But what is the best design? Well, that depends on several factors, including what tools and materials you have available to you and your personal application needs. When building the base frame for a hinged hoop house, I prefer 3x2s due to their great strength to weight ratio and affordability. But of course 2x4s can be used as well. You'll just have a heavier frame with a little bit more cost. When building your frame, always use pilot holes to prevent wood splitting and use 2.5 to 3 inch screws for deeper penetration and strength. Using wood glue will also provide additional strength, but it's not necessary on this project. The easiest way to attach your boards is with a simple butt joint as seen here, but this will provide the least amount of strength. If a screw is driven directly into the end grain, it's running parallel with the wood fibers. So to add more strength, drive your screws in at an angle. This will engage more wood fibers in the side and face grain. For a more aesthetically pleasing joint, use the miter joint after cutting 45-degree angles in each of your boards. But as with the butt joint, try to run at least one of the screws in the miter joint at an angle and not just directly into the end grain. If you happen to own a pocket hole jig, creating a pocket joint will be stronger than the 2 joints mentioned earlier, especially when you drill from both sides of the board. But really, any of these joints should work for you, especially when you add corner braces. These miter braces I'm adding here added a ton of rigidity and stability to my overall frame. There are 6 practical ways to attach your hoop house to the base frame, and I'll go over the pros and cons of each method. In all 6 of these projects, I'll be using light resistant Schedule 40 1/2-inch electrical conduit, but you can use regular PVC as well. The electric conduit is a little more expensive, but you should get several more years out of it due to its UV resistance. The first method requires no extra material. Simply measure out on your base frame where you want your arches to span, and then drill 7/8 holes for attachment points. I'm using a spade bit for this project. Take your drill bit and lay it across the side of your baseboard. This will allow you to mark the proper depth. When drilling your holes, keep your drill bit as perpendicular to the wood surface as possible. If you have an angle in your holes, then when you put your arches in, they're going to want to angle in that direction as well. Unfortunately, I don't have a drill press or a guide to make these holes perfect, but they turned out well enough. This method of attachment supports the conduit arches a lot better than I thought it would, but I would still run a screw through the sides of the board into the conduit after the arches are inserted to hold them in place. In this next method, I'll be using 1-inch EMT electrical conduit cut into 4-inch pieces. These pieces will then be attached to the insides of our base frame using 1-inch pipe straps. For a full supplies list, check the video description. And while you're down there, a like, comment, or subscription does a lot to support my channel, and I greatly appreciate it. I recommend attaching each 4-inch piece of EMT with 2 pipe straps, not the single attachments you see here. After everything is securely drilled into place, inserting your arches is a breeze. You can cut your EMT using a hacksaw, angle grinder, or any other metal cutting saw, but by far the easiest and cleanest way is getting one of these pipe cutter tools. But if you don't want to deal with cutting metal, use Schedule 40 1-inch electrical conduit instead. It works exactly the same and can easily be cut with almost any saw or PVC pipe cutters. However, there is one disadvantage to using this material over the metal. Those 1-inch pipe straps that we use do not fit this thicker material perfectly, but this can be easily remedied by not drilling in your screws all the way. Before we discuss my favorite way of attaching arches, let's briefly review the remaining 2 on our list. Cutting pieces of rebar and pounding them into the ground or attaching them to a base allows a point of attachment where you can slip your pipes over the top of. Out of all the attachments, this is my least favorite option because it leaves pieces of rebar sticking up everywhere. And the second to last option is to directly clamp your 1/2-inch pipe using a 1/2-inch pipe strap. And last but not least is my favorite way to attach the arches, using 1/2-inch PVC end caps. For this method, pre-drill out the middle of all your PVC caps, and then insert a 1 1/4 inch screw and attach them to your desired location. Before we get into the rest of the build, let's do a quick recap. We've measured out our raised garden bed and built an appropriate base frame for our hinged hoop house. Then we've measured out where we want our arches to span, chosen a preferred attachment method, and have everything firmly in place and ready to go. For this project, I'll be building a double layer hoop house. Ideally, I'd want 4 to 8 inches of dead air space between the layers, but for this project, I'll have to compromise with a 2 to 4 inch gap. To gain an extra inch, I attached my 1-inch conduit inserts on the inside of my frame, while leaving my PVC cap attachments on the outer border. Note that I left enough space between these two attachments for a 1.5 inch furring strip to be placed. This will be used to secure the plastic for my first hoop house layer. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to decide how tall of a hoop house we would like. For a 4-foot garden bed, I wouldn't recommend your arches be over 9 feet long. As you can see here, even an 8-foot length is pretty flimsy, and longer arches tend to bow out. For a sturdier hoop house, keep your arch length smaller. To create a half circle arch like the one seen here, measure the length between the arch attachments, then divide that number by 2 and multiply it by 3.14. In this scenario, the width between our attachments is 48 inches, so we divide that by 2 to get 24 inches and times by 3.14, which rounded off equals around 75 inches. Or avoid the math altogether and start big and slowly cut down till you get your desired length. Next, we need to decide how we're going to support our arches with side braces and cut those braces to the right length. A popular option includes using 3/4 inch PVC T connectors that reduce to 1/2 inch at the T, then attaching a single 1/2 inch pipe that spans the length of the hoop house, and using zip ties or tape to attach the middles. But there's a sturdier way to build it. Use 3/4 inch PVC pipe and 3/4 inch connectors all the way around with a cross in the middle. For the first layer of hoop house, I'll need 6 3/4 inch T's and 3 3/4 inch crosses. I'm drilling one pilot hole in each of them so later I can take a screw and attach them to the arches. After measuring between my arches and taking into account the extra space the T and cross connectors will take up, I'll need 6 pieces of 3/4 inch PVC cut at 42 inches each. This step isn't completely necessary, but it does help a lot to sand down the edges a little bit of your PVC or scrape them on a sidewalk. It makes them slip into the connectors much easier. You can pre-assemble all your cross braces on the ground and then slide them onto the arches later, or just slide the slips onto the arches and connect the pipe at the end. Once all the cross braces are assembled and in the right position, use the pilot holes we drilled earlier to attach them to the arches using 1/4 inch screws. And try to keep all your screws on the inside of the hoop house so nothing sharp rips the plastic. We're almost done with the first layer, but before we wrap it in plastic, there are a few more items we need to do on our checklist, including attaching the end caps for our second layer of hoop house. Notice how I'm using the 1.5 inch furring strips to make sure I have enough space so that later we can attach down the plastic. I also like to drive a small screw on the inside of the hoop house where there are any loose attachments, just for security so nothing comes undone in the future. Now that our first layer is complete, all that's left to do is pre-cut our furring strips and apply the plastic. And it's also a good idea to pre-drill all your furring strips with pilot holes. I'm using a 6mm UV resistant plastic from Farmer's Plastic Supply. Once you get your plastic laid out over your hoop house and positioned correctly, secure one end down with the furring strip and screws. Try to keep everything straight and tight with no wrinkles. And when you get to the other side, pull the plastic as tight as you can without tearing it. The tighter you can get the plastic, the more easily your hoop house will shed snowfall and rain. Now if you wish to have a second layer on your hoop house, simply repeat the process. The only difference is this time, when you pull the plastic down, you'll be attaching your furring strips to the sides of your 2x3s. And I should also mention, halfway through this project, I forgot I had these little snap clamps, and they do help quite a bit with keeping your plastic tight. Another step I forgot to do in this build was to attach the hinges to the 2x3s before I put on the second layer of plastic and furring strips. Having forgotten this will require a workaround, as you'll see when I attach this hoop house to my garden bed. Leaving 4 to 6 inches of plastic around your hoop house will help you retighten it if needed in the future, but I'm going to trim off all of mine for a more aesthetic look. Now that I have the hoop house over my garden bed, it's time to attach the hinges. Since I forgot to put the hinges on earlier, I'll have to loosen up the furring strips and slide the hinge between the 2x3 and the furring strip. Next, I'm going to attach an eye hook to the hoop house and one to the garden bed, and connect the two with a chain and some quick links. And for a finishing touch, I'll attach a handle to the hinged hoop house lid. I hope you got a couple good ideas from this video, and if you live in a city that's too windy for a hinged hoop house to survive, watch my video on how to build a polycarbonate cold frame that has even more insulation than this double layer hinged hoop house.